Welcome back. And if you have not been listening previously, I am going over the issue of something that's in the news today, and that is the war that is currently going on with Israel and Hamas. Now, the reason that I'm going over this is because there are the questions that I've heard. There are the protests that have been going on out in the street, and that's around the world, in Australia, different capitals there in the UK. And I believe that there needs to be a clear understanding of what is going on. Earlier, I was going over the legitimacy of Israel, because one of the common things that you will hear, the belief of many in our world today, is that Israel is illegitimate, that we are talking about a foreign people being given someone else's land there in the Middle East as compensation for the Holocaust. And my contention is that there is not one word of that statement that is true. And I think it's important that we understand accurately, correctly, historically, what is going on and form our opinions based on facts. And so last time I began, and I said I was going to be looking at this situation from three perspectives. I wanted to look at this historically, legally, and biblically. And last time we began looking at the historic situation. I started at the year 135 AD, and that was under Roman dominion. And we did a very brief overview, a cursory survey, if you would, of the history. There is so much that was left out. Any one of the particular periods that we covered, there were just so many details. And I just looked in broad strokes at the approximately 2,000 years of history. Well, we didn't finish. Last time we started with Roman domination, and we went through the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks, their rule ended in 1917, 1918, the end of World War I. And I want to pick up from there. We need to start looking at some details that transpire from the 1800s into the 1900s. And as we do that, I cannot help but believe that we're going to see that Israel is indeed legitimate, and they have every right to be there in the land as they are today, and to defend themselves in their homeland. When we get into the 1800s, we are beginning to get the seeds of the modern Jewish movement, resulting in the national entity of Israel. And that movement is known as Zionism. Now, there's, I believe, a lot of confusion about Zionism. What exactly is it? Where did it come from? One of the things you will hear today is that Zionism is racist, it's imperialistic, it's a continuation of colonization. There's any number of things that you will hear about the Zionist movement. I want to take a brief look at Zionism. Zionism, no one was talking about Zionism. That actual word itself was coined in 1890. Before that, you did not hear people talking about Zionism. But in 1890, a man by the name of Nathan Birnbaum coined the term. And that term refers to one of the hills that is there. In the city of Jerusalem, Jerusalem sits on a couple of hills. One of those hills was called Mount Zion. And that is what the Jewish people have looked to for millennia. And they remember the hills of Zion. And from the name of that hill, we then had Birnbaum coin the term Zionism. And what is Zionism? Zionism, and different people will define it in different terms. I believe a definition, and you can look it up in the dictionary. Zionism is the recognized legal right to an autonomous Jewish state in their historic homeland. That, to me, is the essence of Zionism, that the Jewish people have an ancestral homeland, and it is located in what we refer to as Palestine, and that they have a right to be home and to have self-determination when they are home in their ancestral homeland. If you believe that, then you are a Zionist. I am a Zionist. I am not Jewish. I am a Christian, but I believe that the Jews have a right to their ancestral homeland, and they have the right to determine their own destiny, and that they have the right to defend their land. I believe that. Errors that I believe have been assigned to Zionism. One error is that it is a colonial movement. That is not the case, because when you look at colonial movement, you are talking about a nation or an entity, a sovereign, who extends out and establishes colonies. And the colonies are there for the benefit of the motherland. And we do not find that happening with the state of Israel today. Who is Israel reporting back to? The answer is no one. Who are they sending money, taxes, raw goods, raw material, sending back to the homeland? No one, nowhere. As an American, I remember my history, American history, that we were one of the colonies of England, and that we had a revolution. But when we were colonists, it was considered that those of the European extraction living here in North America, they were Englishmen. They were part of the empire ruled from London, and this was one of the English colonies. You don't find that in Israel. They are not sending back anything to anyone. They are not taking orders from a mother country. They are independent. They set their own policies, and they are not a colonial movement. It is said that they are imperialistic. And by imperialism, we are looking at the issue of going out, looking beyond our borders, seeking to conquer for the purpose of economic benefit more than anything else, politics and other issues. But it is specifically looking to get property, territory, influence beyond our borders. That is not Israel. Israel said, we want to have a home in our ancestral homeland. And for those of you that remember your Bible history, when the Jews settled as a nation in Palestine, the land was distributed among the tribes. And so it was the tribe of Naphtali, this section will be yours. The tribe of Gad, this will be your parcel. The tribe of Asher, this is where you are to establish and live your life. And the Jews have said, where we were, our tribes, the ancestral homeland, that's what we want. That and nothing more than. So it is not imperialistic. They are not looking to go into Iraq and into India and into Saudi Arabia and into Egypt. That is not their design. And therefore, they are not imperialistic. It is said that it is a racist movement, that they are out to get the Arabs. Israeli policy has been that those that were in the land, living in the land, they may live in the land, and they have rights just as any other citizen within the land. There have been to date 1 million Arabs, citizens of the state of Israel, and it's very interesting that they have more freedoms than other Arabs in the other Arab states in the region. So it is not colonial, it is not imperialistic, it is not racist. So this nationalistic movement that the Jews have a right to have a nation in their homeland. How did this come about? What do we see happening? You need to remember Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl is known as the father of modern day Zionism. And something to keep in mind is that Herzl did not decide to do something that had never been thought of before. That is not the case. As is true of any movement, any nation, there are the precursors before you actually get national entity, before you get a movement going, and such is true. And so Theodor Herzl was not the originator of the idea of a Jewish homeland or Jewish nationalism. He is the one that was very instrumental in organizing it and putting a face to the movement, but it happened before Herzl. I want to go to the year 1871, because by 1871, the Jewish people in Central and Western Europe were being allowed citizenship in the democracies there on the continent. Before that, they were a separate group within society, and they had rights more or less depending upon the host nation. But come 1871 and the late 1800s, we see a nationalism rising in Europe. And you're going to find that with Germany, with Italy, states, colonies, city-states were beginning to coalesce and become national entities. So 1871, Western Europe, Central Europe, we see the Jews being allowed citizenship. Now, there was a problem for the Jews of the West, and that with citizenship came assimilation. And there were those that were Jews because of their lineage, but in terms of their practice, in terms of beliefs, you could not distinguish them from the rest of society. They were just like anybody else walking the streets of any city there in Western Europe. So with this assimilation, there was a losing of Jewishness that was happening in the West. In the East, however, things tended to be very difficult for the Jewish populations, especially when we have Russia. Come the late 1800s into the 1900s, you still had the Tsar ruling the Russias. And under the Tsars, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. A lot of people may not know this, but there was the ghetto that existed in Russia. That ghetto was called the Pale of Settlement. Now, what that basically was, there was an area that was designated as the Jewish section. And Jews were required to go there, live there, and spend their entire existence within the ghetto confines. And in Russia, there was a sizable area, and it was referred to as the Pale of Settlement. And with this, the Jews, one of the reasons for having the ghetto was to control the Jewish population. Because if they are all here, we can keep an eye on them, we can see what's happening, and when and if we need to, we can then do things to ensure that they are controlled. So that was the purpose of the ghetto. And we see the ghetto happening in a number of areas throughout Europe. But there in Russia, it was the Pale of Settlement. And the Jews were second class, if that, citizens. For instance, if you were a Jewish boy, when you were 10 years old, you were subject to service in the army of the Tsar. And your term of service lasted for 25 years. So if you were a Jewish boy from the age of 10 until 35, you were at the use of the Tsar within his army. None of the other population of Russia had such restrictions, but that was imposed on the Jews there in Russia. Something else that happened was that there were the pogroms. Now, there are those of you that may have heard that word. You're not familiar with what it is. But a pogrom is basically a government-sponsored or a government-allowed riot. And so there were the riots that were allowed to be instigated against the Jews as a population because they were Jewish. And the government either kind of whipped up a fervor to proceed with one of the riots, or if there was a riot, the government would just kind of look the other way and go, oh, well, that's okay. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The year was 1903. The current country of Moldova. At the time, it was under Tsarist rule. It was under Tsarist control. And the capital of Moldova is Chisinau. Now, forgive me, my pronunciation. I'm not sure if that's the proper pronunciation. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the capital of what is Moldova, it has been around for years and years and years. And at the time, there in that town, there was the pogrom that lasted for 2 days. In the 2 days of that pogrom, there were 49 Jews killed, 500 were injured, 700 homes were destroyed, and 600 businesses, these are all Jewish homes, Jewish businesses, were looted and destroyed. 2 days. That was one pogrom. And there were a series of pogroms throughout the Eastern European theater against the Jewish people. So, in the west of Europe, there was the danger of the loss of Jewish identity through assimilation. And in the east, there was the danger of just losing your life, either because you would just simply directly killed in one of the pogroms, or the conditions would be so harsh that you really could not sustain your life, sustain a family. So either east or west, the Jews faced real difficulty, and there then began to beat within the Jewish breast a desire to go home. And I believe that this was God ordained. God inspired this. God began to move. We find that there was the religious movement and there was the secular movement within the Jewish world. Let me first go with the religious. There are two names. These are not the only names, but these are probably more so well known if you are familiar with this topic than other names at the time. But among the Orthodox Jews, there was the Judah Al-Galai. He was a Sephardic Jew near the town of Belgrade. And the second was Zvi Hirsch Kalashir. He was Ashkenazi Jew in Poland. They did not know of the work that the other was doing, but they both came to the conclusion that the anti-Semitism that they saw around them was not going to stop, and that the only hope for the Jew was to go home. And as Orthodox Jews, they believed in the coming of the Messiah. And part of their belief was that the Messiah is not going to come until there are Jews in the homeland. That was part of their thinking. And so there are the writings that came from these two men, unbeknownst one to the other. They worked independently, one of the other, but they both kind of came to the same conclusion, and that was religiously. So what we see is that the seeds are being planted. And we're talking about the early to mid 1800s with these two men religiously. On the secular side, and within Judaism, well, among the Jewish people, it is true, as is true of every single religion on the face of the earth. I don't care if you're Zoroastrian, if you're Hindu, if you're Buddhist. Not everybody agrees 100% across the board on everything. And you have certain individuals that they believe very deeply, very sincerely, and such people have been known as fundamentalists. And you will hear as fundamentalist Christians, you will hear of fundamentalist Muslims, you will hear of fundamentalist Hindus. You're going to find that even to this very day. And while there may be fundamentalists, there are those that are like, well, yeah, my family is, I was born into a family that way, but they themselves don't necessarily believe or even care about the underpinnings, the teachings, and that we would refer to as secular. So from the religious perspective, we had the two men there in the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi communities of Jews, but on the secular side, there was a gentleman named Moses Hess. Now, Moses Hess believed in nationalism, and he came to the point where he said the only way that the Jews are going to be able to survive is if we have our own homeland. And so we need a national entity. And he molded his beliefs after the movement that was happening in Italy. Those of you that remember your history, we go back to the medieval times and into the modern era, there were the papal states and there were the city-states that were around through the peninsula there that we know as Italy. But in the 1800s, there was a movement to unify all of this and come up with one identity, Italian. And one of the gentlemen that proposed that was a gentleman by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini. And Moses Hess modeled his nationalism after what was happening there in Italy, the model after Giuseppe Mazzini. Another one on the secular side within the Jewish world was Leon Pinsker. He believed that no matter what, anti-Semitism was inevitable, and there was a movement that developed called Lovers of Zion, and he was one of the founders, very influential in that movement. And among those people, there were those that did actually go to Palestine. The year was 1882. And in 1882, there were 7,000 followers of the Lovers of Zion movement in Palestine, and they established an agricultural community. 1882. Palestine was still under Ottoman rule, and so this was under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire, but the first agricultural community, Jews, 1882. So the seeds were planted, and you then really start getting fruition. It's kind of like you've heard, from the acorn comes the mighty oak. You find this big, strong tree, this oak tree, but it began when that little acorn went into the ground. We're looking from the religious side and the secular side. These are the seeds going into the ground that eventually spring up and come into life. And that's where we get the gentleman Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl came from a family there in Budapest. He was, I believe, 24 years old. He had received his doctorate of law degree, and he was totally secular. He worked for a newspaper out of Vienna, and he was the correspondent who was working in Paris. Paris, when we are talking the 1800s, Paris is a mover, shaker on the European continent, going back to Napoleon, the very early 1800s, and even then after, we find that what happens in Paris has an influence throughout the European theater. Well, Herzl is working in Paris as a correspondent for the newspaper, and it was in 1894. There was the Dreyfus trial. Dreyfus was a Jew, assimilated Jew into French society. He was an officer in the French army, and he went on trial for treason. The charges against him were that he was selling secrets to the Germans, and so he went on trial. And what was happening during that trial absolutely shocked Theodore Herzl, because as the trial was going on, there was an anti-Semitic fervor that was building, and there were people that were going through the streets of Paris yelling, "Death to the Jews," because one man was on trial for treason. A whole people were being condemned, and it was death to the Jews. This shocked Theodore Herzl to his core, and he came to the belief, if it can happen here in France, the most enlightened, the most Jew-accepting society that we have, if this can go on here, then there is no hope. Anti-Semitism is here, it's here to stay, and we have no hope. By the way, the trial for Dreyfus, he was convicted, he was sent to Devil's Island. However, it was very, very obvious it was trumped up charges. It was very obvious that everything that was said was not true, that he was innocent. And although he was convicted, it was overturned later. He was sent to Devil's Island, spent some time in the penal colony there, but it was totally bogus, and the French judicial system corrected the wrong that was perpetrated upon him. He was exonerated. But Herzl, we have to do something. And so he began to work for a national Jewish homeland. With his position, he was, not that he was super famous, but he had connections, being a journalist, a correspondent, as he was, coming from his background, a family that was known and respected. Herzl went and he had conversations and audiences with top officials in various governments. The Secretary of State for England, for instance, the United Kingdom. He went to England. He spoke to the commissioner of the Russian Tsar. He went and spoke with the Ottoman Turks. He went to a number of government officials, powers, and he is pitching for a national homeland there in Palestine. Well, we find that he is then the founder of the World Zionist Organization. And then we finally get in 1897, that was the year, we get the World Zionist Congress. It met in Basel, Switzerland, 1897. And with that, Theodore Herzl wrote that today I have founded the state of Israel. And his expectation was that within 50 years, that there would be a national state of Israel on the map. Now, while this is going on, and the year is 1897, we find that across Europe, there were the problems that were happening and the feeling of that we need to go home, we need our own nation, was growing in the Jewish populace. And we then get what is known as Aliyah. Aliyah is the Jewish word meaning ascent. And basically it means we're going home. And so we find that the Jewish people begin to return to Palestine. They didn't do it all at once, but it came in waves. It's almost like if you've been at the beach, the ocean with the tides, and you can see a wave. It's not one big, huge wave. It's a wave that comes in, then a second wave, then a third wave. And that is how the Jewish return to the land occurred. And there would then be the wave, and each wave was referred to as Aliyah. The first Aliyah, we're really looking at 1881. And as I said, in the year 1882, we have the very first agricultural community of Jews. It was 7,000 of them there in Palestine. The Ottoman Turks are still in control of the land. So that was the first Aliyah. We're talking about 1881 to 1903. Within that first Aliyah, that first wave, there were 25,000 Jews who returned to the land. It was mostly from Eastern Europe, primarily Russia, 25,000, and that was because of the pogroms. The pogrom that I had mentioned earlier that happened in Moldova, as I said, that was just one of numerous pogroms. And there were the Jews that said, we need to go. With the first Aliyah, they left Russia, and the majority came to the United States. But there was the branch of the Jewish people that went back to the homeland, 25,000 of them. It was during this time, Aliyah 1, we have Eliezer ben Yehuda. Now, most people have no clue what name is that? Who is this guy? He is known as the father of the modern Hebrew language. Hebrew was basically a dead language. Not that it had gone into total existence, it still existed among a very small number of rabbis. So if you went to the older rabbis who were very scholarly, had spent their entire lives in study of Talmud, they knew Hebrew. But by and large, it's kind of like today in the Roman Catholic Church, up until recently, the Latin Mass was typical. And the Mass was said in Latin. How many people walking around New York, America, anywhere, knew Latin? Very small percentage. It would be the priests that studied Latin when they were in seminary, maybe even after their schooling, and they knew enough of the language of the Latin to do the Latin Mass. That's kind of what was happening among the Jews. Hebrew was not totally dead, but it was just basically among the rabbis. Well, this Ben Yehuda, he was the one that took the Hebrew language out of the rabbi study and updated the language. His children, his son, he would not have him speak anything except Hebrew there in the house. And if you have any inclination of how difficult this is, what he was responsible for was the rebirth of the Hebrew language. And there are now millions of people on Earth. Population of Israel today, they speak Hebrew. Well, it's because of this gentleman, Ben Yehuda. And the Hebrew that is spoken today, the Hebrew that is written today, if they read the ancient texts going back 1,000 years, it's the same. They can read it. They can understand what was written 1,000 years ago. Try to get somebody to read Shakespeare and see if that happens today. But it is true of Hebrew. But the first Aliyah, we get the rebirth of the language of Hebrew. We then go to the second Aliyah, 1904 to 1914. And we find that that's the second wave, and it was 40,000 returned to Palestine, and it was primarily from Russia. We find David Ben-Gurion. That is a name that most of you will probably be familiar with. David Ben-Gurion, he came during that second Aliyah. There was A.D. Gordon. He came. He's an important person, but most folks don't know why. Yitzhak Ben Zvi, he is the second president in the history of the modern day state of Israel. He came to the land during the second Aliyah. Now, I want to get back to this guy, A.D. Gordon. Most folks have never heard of him, much less know why he should be considered. He was an important player in the history of modern day Israel, because if you know anything about Israel, you would have heard the term kibbutz. The kibbutz were agricultural social communities, and those that lived and were part of those communities are known as kibbutzim, the kibbutzim. That is due to A.D. Gordon. A.D. Gordon introduced the understanding, and it's referred to as avodah ivrit. Once again, avodah ivrit. And that is the belief that the land itself needed to have a rebirth. And that rebirth would come about through Jewish sweat and labor. So it's not that others could not be hired. You could not hire someone to help you in the recultivation of the land, but it had to be Jews who brought about the rebirth of the land. That's the idea, avodah ivrit. Now, what does that got to do with anything? Because it is from this understanding that you get the kibbutz movement. And the kibbutz are very, very important in the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948. Very, very important. So, A.D. Gordon, the idea, rebirth of the land because of the work of the Jews, and as such, we then get agricultural communities starting to spring up throughout the land, and that's the kibbutz system. So David Ben-Gurion, Yitzhak Ben Zvi, A.D. Gordon, these are men that came during the second Aliyah. Now, because of what Gordon had said, the Jews were working the land, and we see the land beginning to come back to life. If you remember when we did our survey of history, we talked about under the Mamluks and then under the Ottoman Turks, we saw a continuing desolation of the land, deforestation of the land, and that in the north, we find the development of malarial swamps, and in the south, the land just turns into a desert. Well, because of the kibbutz and them working the land, up north, they started to drain the swamps. They were buying land. If you remember in our discussion under the Ottoman Turks in the land of Palestine, there were those that did get deeds from the Turkish government, and they were by and large absentee landlords. Well, the Jewish people started buying up land from the landlords. And when they bought the land, they began to bring it back to life. In the north, Galilee, there was then the draining of the swamps. And with the draining of the swamps, you then get the malaria to start leaving the area. In the south, they begin, not that they do it extensively, but there's the beginning of the reforestation of the land. Begins at this time. So, second Aliyah, very important movement. The first, rebirth of the Hebrew language with settlers, yashuv. That is the Hebrew word settlers, yashuv. The first. The second, we get the birth of the kibbutz, and then we come to the third movement. And that took place 1919 to 1923. So once again, we see that it was primarily from Russia, and 40,000 returned during this third wave of immigration. So first wave of immigration, we get 25,000. Second wave, 40,000. Third wave, 40,000. The Jews are starting to come home. Brings us up to a very important event in history, the years 1914 to 1918. And those are the years of World War I. That was a terribly important time in world history, very, very important for the Jews as well. Coming up the years just before and the years following World War I, it is very instrumental in the life of Israel, because these are the years we see the Zionist movement. It comes into existence, it grows. It's not going to come to fruition until after World War II, but during World War I, and then after World War I, the 20-year period between World War I, World War II, we see Zionism, the Zionist movement growing. We have a number of nations, and this is one of the very first times, well, no, not one of the very first times, it is the first time that we find the world, literally the world, at war. Before this time, there were wars ever since, man has been recording history. However, throughout all of history, they were local, regional wars. Come World War I, this is the first time that it ever happened. The entire world is at war. This will then result in the end of the Ottoman Empire, and that is going to prove very important as we look at the history of Israel. So we're going to stop here at this point. We will continue and see you, God willing, in our next session. God bless.